7. Okay, this section of the video, all I want to do is mention hiss and amplifier noise, as well as mechanical noise that would come through the headphone amplifier or headphone outputs of any of these units. They include essentially all just Minidisc players and recorders, as well as my iPod video or iPod 5G, no matter how you call it. I must mention just one thing as a preamble, and that is that Minidisc was essentially at its end. When the iPod came out, there was only 1 year of production of Minidisc. Sorry, when the iPod 5G came out. And prior to that, Minidisc was fighting for its life against incumbent MP3 players. Most of these had hard disks, some of them, or flash-based memory. And a lot of them, both MP3 players as well as MD players at the time, had problems of essentially not having the best amplifiers on board. MD companies, especially Sharp, and the Sharp units represented here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These 5 units went on a marketing blitz, and they brought out this thing called the 1-bit Sharp Minidisc player, and they call it Wowee, and they basically touted that its amplification unit was better than anyone's. And the MD people in general, the fans like myself, including myself actually, bought that hook, line and sinker. People calling it like the most airy sounding and just wonderful treble, and that it just blew away the competition, sounded much better than Sony. Now, I never exactly thought that the Sharps sounded better than the Sonys, and I had a number of problems with them at the time. But there is one thing that's generally true about most, but not all, of the Sharp Wowee units, and that is that they produce very little hiss, and that includes even very little hiss when plugging in extremely sensitive earphones from today. Back in the day, there were not a lot of really sensitive earphones, and so you could plug in almost anything, even to some of these noisier players, like this one, and get very little hiss. However, even at that time, there were some players like this Kenwood would just bother the hell out of me. But today's high sensitivity earphones, something like the Shure SE846 or the Campfire Audio Andromeda, and even this one, which is the Grado GR8, which I have basically re-terminated to work with Flare Audio's Bluetooth DAC, are sensitive enough to pick up hiss from any and all of these units. Now the Campfire one is sensitive enough to probably pick up a little bit more hiss than these ones, but essentially modern day earphones really bring out and showcase the problems of these older units. So, all I'm going to do today is rank order the most noisy of these to the least noisy of these. Actually, I'm going to do the opposite direction. The least noisy to the most noisy. And I've made this handy little cheat sheet. I hope the camera will focus on it. And essentially, all it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a list, and then Roman numerals describing what I have written down in detail on another cheat sheet. And those go from 1 to 5. So I want to just bring out the best ones in the group, and those are the Sharps, as I said. Those are the Sharp DS8. There's actually a DS9, but it's a variation of the DS8. The Sharp DS70, that's this one and this one, as well as the Sharp DS504, which is this one. This is a lower cost unit. All of them have essentially, I'll say no hiss. They actually have hiss. You can hear it very faintly. It's on a par with the $3,500 Aston Kern AK380 or their $2,000 player, which is AK240, and it's much lower than some of the modern Sony units. It's low hiss that should not bother anyone. So hurrah to Sharp. After that come the Sony, two units, the Sony MZ NH3D, which is a downloader high MD unit, as well as the Panasonic SJ-M17. And the MJ17, is my favorite player because the controls along the top are really easy to use. They're large enough for a thumb. You can barely use them with gloves, and the unit is robust. It's pretty precision made, and it sounds actually pretty decent. It actually measures not so bad, but its noise, as well as the noise from the Sony, are quite a bit higher than these 4 Sharp Wowee units. And when I say quite a bit higher, you'll definitely hear it at all volumes, through earphones like this, like the GR8 from Grado, and certainly from the Campfires. Now, is it a lot? Is it too much? Well, it's a lot lower than a lot of high-end DAPs today. It's a lot lower than Sony's ZX300, which I have, which is a $600 to $800 player. It's a lot lower than their $3,000 player, which I think is called the ZX2. I can't remember exactly, or in something like that. It's gold. It's heavy. It's like a brick. You can throw it through a window. It's a lot lower than those. It's a lot lower than some Ibasso high-end units and some Fios. It's low, but you will notice it. The good thing is that hiss, which again is low, but you will notice, does not go up or down depending on the amp setting. So if you put your volume to 30 or 25 out of whatever, which is I think the highest that it will go, you won't be bothered by it any more than you will at low volumes, which means that when you're listening to music at high volumes, the hiss essentially melts away, and at low volumes you'll notice it, but it does not at all occlude your music. Next on the list is the iPod 5G. A little bit surprised by this. I've always been a little bit annoyed, well, when I say always, at least recently, been a little bit annoyed by the hiss of the iPod 5G. And the reason of that is because I use sensitive earphones. These are quite sensitive, they hear hiss from everything, even these four that I say don't have hiss, because it's so low that it just doesn't bother me. But the 5G is noticeable. And I'll often compare in my audio reviews certain amplifiers from today, and if they pass the 5G test, I consider them generally good for sensitive earphone use. If they don't pass it and they have higher hiss, then I simply reject the use of sensitive earphones with them at all. And the 5G has slightly more hiss than these two. Perhaps I would say another third or another half more hiss than these two units. But the problem it has is that the hiss is also interspersed with a bit of mechanical noise, or perhaps it's noise from the power supply, which goes, instead of just a steady shh sound, inside the steady shh sound is little ticks and little very small, but they are noticeable. And so when you play music, you will hear the hiss sound. You'll probably not hear those little ticking sounds, but they exist, and if you are worried by hiss at all, you may be worried by the sound that you get from the iPod. After the iPod 5G, and the first unit on this table that does not pass the iPod 5G test, is the Sony MZ B100, which is a business recorder. Has two stereo mics here, two mics here which form a stereo image, and it has a playback speaker here. The playback speaker is horrible, the mics are okay, you can plug in power microphones from externally, and it does a very good job of recording. Of course, if you really want to get, if today it's really silly to use a Sony like that when you can use a Sony like this, which does 24-bit 96 Hertz, and you can upload via USB into your computer, instead of then playing this thing through another deck and then recording to your computer and just having trouble. But anyway, this unit hisses more than the iPod 5G, not by a lot, but it's enough. And again, it's steady, which is good, so you don't have to worry about the sort of ticking sound that you get with the iPod. But it's more hiss, it's a little bit more noticeable. If you have sensitive earphones, you are probably going to be bothered by it if you listen at anything from low volumes to medium volumes. Now, the good thing about this unit is that it sustains current at any volume load pretty damn well, even under load. So you plug in a pair of earphones and you're not going to notice a lot of bass drop, where you do, especially with the Panasonic, and the sharps are not very good. The iPod is essentially better measuring than any of these units on the table, despite never having been marketed as a high-end or high-quality sounding device. And this one probably comes in second place after the iPod. Next in line are two units, one which I love, one which I hated from the very beginning. The one I hated from the very beginning is the Kenwood Dmc S55, which is this beautiful pink thing here, horribly manufactured, lots of plastic in the wrong places. It's not plastic in the good places like the Panasonic, it's plastic and metal that melds and bends and just is horrible. But worse than that, absolutely atrocious, it's its amplifier. A heap of noise at the lowest volume. It just, all you hear is like a low-level vacuum cleaner in the background. And the Iowa, which has one of the most beautiful bass, mega bass systems I've ever heard in any unit, and in fact one that I just love listening to today, as long as I don't have sensitive earphones, hisses a lot. And unfortunately, you just cannot use sensitive earphones, or I would say at this point, earphones of any type really are annoying to use through this one and this one. It's just too much. And Kenwood are another brand that basically marketed their digital amplifier, and it's horrible. Later on, they used sharp internals, and I don't know, I'd imagine that as Kenwood basically cheapen up everything that they made, I can't imagine it was very good. I could be getting that wrong. Could be that JVC or Victor were the one that did that. But in any case, Kenwood, if you are into Minidisc, do not get a Kenwood. They're horrible. They're made horribly. I've had 3 different units. Each of them, none of them broke down actually. My Sharps broke down, but the Kenwoods never broke down. But they basically produced horrible output. Lots of hiss, really slow to wake up. Sometimes you just don't know what's going on. Is it working? Is it not working? And just bad sound. And finally on this list, and this is the most surprising to me, is Sharp's last, which means their latest generation, their newest Wowee 1-bit unit. And this is the DP700. It came with some speakers. It's supposed to be, well, it's the last in their line. You would think Sharp have taken everything they've learned from the Wowee units and everything, all the technology that they can pack into a single device and just make the best that they ever could have done. Unfortunately, it is atrocious. The background noise essentially transferred from mechanical stuff on the innards to the power supply to everything just occludes music. At the low volumes that I listen to, all I hear is between tracks. It's worse. Instead of just going cleanly from track to track as these other Wowee units do, as basically everyone else does, you hear and that's not just sounds of the unit that are created from, you know, spinning the disc and everything else. It is coming through the bloody amplifier. It's a horrible sound. I do not recommend this player to anyone unless you're using something like a 300 ohm headphone. Of course, if you're using a 300 ohm headphone, you're not at all going to get much volume out of it, and you're not going to get much music. This is just a piece of crap, and Sharp should be ashamed to have ever debuted it. Unfortunately, it's much more robust than the DS8, and it's a little bit more robust than these other units, but it is the worst sounding portable I've ever heard outside of a knockoff Lego MP3 player, which I have upstairs. It's horrible. Now, of course, all of these Sharps measure poorly. The best I've been able to see through Rightmark Audio Analyzer is 86, I believe, 86 to 90 decibels unloaded of signal to noise ratio. All of them give you something like 0.1% THD. Loaded or unloaded, and then loaded, it's much higher. They measure as basically like a really, 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 really bad, extremely bad, the sort of bad that doesn't happen really in the audio world. They measure about as bad as a really bad valve or tube amplifier, and part of that makes me wonder what it was that people really liked about the Sharps. For instance, like I said in the earlier, they get minus 23 decibels of stereo separation when they should get 96 to 98 unloaded. The iPod gets 92, so it's so bad that I wonder if people don't really care about sound quality in terms of how the sound cleaves to the original signal. So if the original signal is, as the test signals are, is basically you're supposed to get 96 decibels in each one of these criteria, and each of them you're supposed to get that, but you don't, and people loved that sound anyway. Either they were completely blinded by the marketing and just bought the marketing, or people don't care about actual sound quality. They don't want the sound to sound like the original recording. They want it to be either too bassy, or they want essentially no stereo image at all, like the Sharps, and they want almost like a buffed up mono sound. or they really like a high amount of distortion. I can't tell. But I'll say this, Minidisc overall was completely outclassed, outmoded by almost any MP3 player, even from the same generation, in terms of actually cleaving to the original signal. But I also agree that some of them, while they didn't measure well, to my ears sounded very nice. This Panasonic is one of my favorite sounding devices of all time. I also really like the Sony. Interestingly enough, the Sony measures very well. And it has an okay sort of bass engine. This one has a really bad bass engine, so if you like to update with EQs, etc., it's not exactly the most exciting, but measures well. Sounds, to my ears, it's not my favorite sound, but it's okay. These ones, the Sharp Wowee, I never really loved, but I loved holding them, and they're beautiful designs. The Kenwood, I never really liked the sound of. This one, as much hiss as it produces, is one of my favorite sounding devices of all time. Doesn't measure well, but you know, that is kind of the story of Minidisc portable players. My deck upstairs, which is I believe it's called a Sony JE780, has A-track type R and S, measures really well and sounds phenomenal. So it's not, to my ears at least, I don't appear to have a prejudice that favors really bad measuring or really good measuring devices. I have a prejudice which essentially likes whatever this produces, and I really love the Sony upstairs. Best sounding device that's ever been on my desk to my ears, and it measures okay. But yeah, that's basically the rundown of it. If you want to pass the iPod video 5G test, this device fails, this device fails, this device fails, and this one completely sucks. Whereas these 4 devices and these 2, and of course the iPod video, pass the test and are worthy to plug into sensitive earphones like the Grado GR8 with some provisos. But that's it. Thank you very much.